What happens when a joke meant to get a laugh becomes the reason your husband hands you divorce papers? How could one careless insult at a family dinner tear a marriage apart, leaving you holding the blame while he quietly gathers proof? Can honesty fix what cruelty broke, or does it only speed up the ending? The crystal chandelier cast warm light across our table at Benedetti's, the kind of upscale Italian place where Graham always insisted we celebrate family birthdays. His mother Miriam sat primly across from me, her silver hair perfectly styled, while my sister Jules chatted animatedly about her latest promotion. Our 7-year-old daughter Etta picked at her pasta, occasionally glancing between the adults with that knowing look kids get when they sense undercurrents they can't quite grasp. I should have been happy. This was supposed to be Miriam's 62nd birthday dinner, a pleasant family gathering. But watching Graham methodically cut his chicken marsala, barely contributing to the conversation beyond polite nods, I felt that familiar itch of frustration building under my skin. "So, Odessa," Miriam was saying, her tone carrying that subtle edge it always had when addressing me. "How are things at the insurance office? Still handling those challenging claims?" I forced a smile. "Business is good. Actually, we just hired this amazing new adjuster, Shane Marwick." I glanced at Graham, hoping to see some flicker of interest, maybe even jealousy. Nothing. He continued eating with the same mechanical precision he brought to his architectural drawings. "Shane's been such a help with the complex cases," I continued, my voice gaining momentum. "He's so dynamic, really knows how to take charge of a situation." Jules raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like quite the catch. Single? Divorced?" I replied, perhaps too quickly. "But he's got this incredible energy, always making everyone laugh, you know. Some men just have that natural confidence." Graham's fork paused for half a second before resuming its steady rhythm. That tiny hesitation sent a thrill through me. Finally, a reaction. "It's so refreshing to work with someone who isn't afraid to speak up," I pressed on. "Someone who fills a room when he walks in. You know what I mean?" Miriam's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm sure your husband appreciates hearing about your dynamic colleague." The sarcasm in her voice should have been a warning, but I was riding the wave of finally getting some attention. Graham had looked up from his plate, his dark eyes meeting mine with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not anger exactly, but something sharper than his usual distant politeness. "Oh, Graham doesn't mind," I said with a laugh that sounded too bright even to my own ears. "He knows I need a little excitement in my life. After all, not everyone can be as reserved as my husband." Etta shifted in her seat, her small hand reaching for her water glass. "Mummy, why are you talking funny?" "I'm just being honest, sweetheart," I said, patting her hand while keeping my eyes on Graham. "Honesty is important in a marriage, isn't it, honey?" Graham set down his fork with careful precision. "Is it?" Something in his tone made my pulse quicken. This was more engagement than I'd gotten from him in months. The attention felt intoxicating after so many nights of him coming home late, burying himself in blueprints, treating me like another piece of furniture in our carefully designed house. "Absolutely," I said, leaning back in my chair with newfound confidence. "Like, I think it's important for spouses to acknowledge their limitations, their differences." Jules was watching me now with growing concern, but I couldn't stop myself. The wine, the audience, the rare moment of having Graham's full attention, it all combined into a reckless momentum. Take Shane, for instance. He's got this presence, this bigness about him. Not just physically, though he is quite impressive that way. I gestured vaguely with my wineglass. But personality-wise, too. He commands respect, makes people listen when he talks. "Odessa," Jules said quietly, but I was on a roll. "It's just funny how different men can be, you know? Some are these big, powerful types who take up space and make things happen, and others—" I looked directly at Graham with what I thought was a playful smile. "Others are more the quiet, small type, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with being compact. The table had gone completely silent. Even the ambient restaurant noise seemed to fade as everyone processed what I'd just said. Miriam's face had gone white, her knuckles tight around her wine stem. Jules was staring at me in horror, but it was Etta's confused whisper that cut through the silence. "Daddy's not small." Graham's expression hadn't changed, but something cold and final had settled in his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was perfectly calm, perfectly controlled. "You're right, Odessa. Honesty is important." He reached for his wallet, pulled out several bills, and placed them neatly beside his barely touched plate. "This should cover dinner and tip." "Graham, where are you going?" Miriam asked, her voice tight with concern. "Home," he said simply, standing up. He leaned down to kiss Etta's forehead. "Happy birthday, Mum. Odessa can give you a ride home." And then he was gone, walking through the restaurant with that same measured pace he used for everything else. No scene, no raised voice, no dramatic exit. Just gone. The silence stretched until Jules finally cleared her throat. "Well, that was something." Miriam was staring at me with undisguised disgust. "How could you? In public, in front of your daughter?" "It was just a joke," I said, but the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "He's being oversensitive." "A joke?" Miriam's voice rose slightly before she caught herself, glancing at Etta. "You humiliated your husband in front of his family." I was being honest about our differences, I insisted, but doubt was creeping in. Graham's reaction had been so final, so unlike his usual patient tolerance of my complaints and criticisms. Jules was already signaling for the check. Maybe we should call it tonight. As we gathered our things, I caught sight of my reflection in the restaurant's mirrors. I looked flushed, excited even, like someone who'd just won an argument, but Graham's empty chair seemed to mock that feeling of victory. "Mummy, why did Daddy leave?" Etta asked as we waited for our coats. "He just needed some air, sweetheart," I said, but even as I spoke, I wondered if that was true. There had been something different in his eyes tonight, something that looked less like hurt and more like decision. The drive home was tense, Miriam sitting in stony silence, while Jules made awkward small talk with Etta. When we pulled into our driveway, Graham's car was already there, but the house was dark except for a single light in his study. "Maybe you should apologize," Jules suggested quietly as we said our goodbyes. "For what? For being honest about our marriage?" But even as I said it, I felt a strange unease settling in my stomach. Inside, the house felt different somehow, colder. I found Graham in his study, laptop open, surrounded by neat stacks of papers. He didn't look up when I entered. "You're being ridiculous," I said, trying to inject some authority into my voice. "It was just dinner conversation." He continued typing, his fingers moving across the keyboard with mechanical precision. "Graham, I'm talking to you." Finally, he looked up. His eyes were completely calm, which somehow felt worse than anger would have. "I heard you," he said simply, loud and clear. Something in his tone made my chest tighten. This wasn't going the way these conversations usually went. Usually, he'd get quiet for a day or two, then things would go back to normal. But this felt different, final. "What are you working on?" I asked, trying to see his screen. "Just some projects," he said, closing the laptop. "I think I'll sleep in the guest room tonight. Long day tomorrow." He gathered his papers into a neat stack, locked them in his desk drawer, and walked past me without another word. I stood there in his study, surrounded by his architectural awards and carefully organized bookshelves, feeling like I'd just lost something important without quite understanding what it was. Outside, I could hear him moving around in the guest room, the quiet sounds of someone settling in for what might be a very long stay. The next morning brought an uncomfortable silence that seemed to seep into every corner of our house. Graham was already gone when I woke up, his coffee cup rinsed and placed in the dishwasher with his usual precision. A note on the counter informed me He'd taken Etta to school and would be working late. At the office, I found myself gravitating toward Shane's cubicle more than usual. He looked up from his computer screen with that easy smile that always made my pulse quicken slightly. "Rough night?" he asked, taking in what I assumed were the dark circles under my eyes. "Family dinner drama," I said, settling into the chair beside his desk. "You know how it is with husbands. They can be so sensitive about everything." Shane leaned back in his chair, his attention fully focused on me. It was such a contrast to Graham's distracted politeness that I felt myself warming under his gaze. "Want to talk about it?" he asked. "I've got some experience with marital drama myself." So I told him about the dinner, about Graham's overreaction, about how frustrated I was with his constant emotional distance. Shane listened with the kind of engaged attention I'd been craving at home. "Sounds like he's threatened," Shane said when I finished. "Guys like that, the quiet controlling types, they can't handle it when their wives show any independence." "Exactly," I said, feeling validated for the first time since last night. "I mean, all I did was acknowledge that we're different people with different strengths. If he can't handle a little honesty..." "Some men just can't appreciate what they have," Shane said, his voice dropping slightly. "If you were my wife, I'd never take you for granted like that." The comment sent a little thrill through me, even as a small voice in my head whispered that this was dangerous territory. But after months of feeling invisible in my own marriage, Shane's attention felt like sunlight after a long winter. "We should grab lunch," he continued. "Sounds like you could use someone to talk to who actually listens." I agreed, probably too quickly. Lunch stretched into 2 hours at a quiet bistro across town. Shane was charming, attentive, asking all the right questions about my feelings and frustrations. He shared stories about his own divorce, painting his ex-wife as cold and unappreciative, himself as the wronged party who'd tried everything to save his marriage. "The thing is," he said, leaning across the table, "life's too short to spend it with someone who doesn't see your worth." When he reached across to touch my hand, I didn't pull away. Back at the office, I felt lighter than I had in months. Shane's attention had reminded me that I was still attractive, still interesting, still worth pursuing. It wasn't until I was driving home that guilt began to creep in around the edges of my euphoria. But that guilt evaporated the moment I walked into our house and found it empty, except for a note saying Graham had picked up Etta and taken her to his mother's for dinner. No invitation for me to join. No explanation beyond the bare facts. I called Jules, needing someone to talk to. "How are things with Graham?" she asked immediately. "Worse," I admitted. "He's giving me the silent treatment, making unilateral decisions about Etta. It's like he's trying to punish me for being honest about our problems." "Des," Jules said carefully, "what you said at dinner, it was pretty harsh." "I was just acknowledging reality," I said, feeling defensive. "We have problems, Jules. Real problems. Graham's emotionally unavailable. He never touches me anymore. He treats me like a roommate. Maybe if he'd been paying attention to his wife instead of his blueprints, I wouldn't have to look elsewhere for basic human connection." The words hung in the air, and I realized I'd just admitted something I hadn't even fully acknowledged to myself. "Look elsewhere," Jules repeated. "Des, please tell me you're not..." "I'm not doing anything wrong," I said quickly. "But I deserve to feel appreciated. I deserve to feel wanted. If Graham can't provide that, then maybe he shouldn't be surprised when other men step up." Jules was quiet for a long moment. "Just be careful, okay? Think about Etta. Think about what you really want before you do something you can't take back." After we hung up, I found myself pacing our empty house, my emotions swinging between righteous anger and nagging doubt. When Graham finally came home with Etta around 8, he was polite but distant, helping our daughter with homework while barely acknowledging my presence. "How was dinner with your mother?" I asked, trying to inject some normalcy into the conversation. "Fine," he replied without looking up from Etta's math worksheet. "Did she have anything to say about last night?" This time he did look at me, and I saw that same cold finality I'd glimpsed at the restaurant. "She thinks you owe her an apology," he said quietly. "So do I." "For what? For being honest about our marriage?" "For humiliating me in public," he said, his voice still calm, but with an edge I'd rarely heard before. "For talking about another man's attributes while discussing your husband's limitations in front of our daughter and my mother." Put like that, it did sound worse than I'd intended, but I wasn't ready to back down. "Maybe if you showed half the interest in our marriage that you show in your work, we wouldn't have these problems," I shot back. Graham looked at me for a long moment, then returned his attention to Etta's homework. "We'll talk about this later." But we didn't talk about it later. Graham disappeared into his study after putting Etta to bed, and when I tried to follow him, I found the door locked. I stood outside that locked door, feeling shut out in my own home, and pulled out my phone to text Shane. "Thanks for listening today. It meant more than you know." His response came quickly. "Anytime. You deserve so much better." I stared at that message for a long time before finally heading to our empty bedroom, wondering when exactly my marriage had become a cold war and whether I even wanted to fight for peace anymore. The next morning brought more of the same polite distance from Graham, but also a text from Shane asking if I wanted to grab coffee before work. I said yes, telling myself it was just friendship, just someone who understood what I was going through. But when Shane smiled at me across the coffee shop table and told me how beautiful I looked, I felt something shift inside me. Something that felt like a door opening, or maybe closing. I wasn't sure which, and I wasn't sure I cared anymore. The tension at home had settled into a cold routine over the following weeks. Graham maintained his polite distance, speaking to me only when necessary, sleeping in the guest room, treating me like a housemate he barely tolerated. Meanwhile, my lunch dates with Shane had become a daily occurrence, the highlight of increasingly grey days. So when Etta's school announced their annual Spring Arts Festival, I saw it as an opportunity to force some normalcy back into our family dynamic. Surely Graham wouldn't maintain his cold shoulder in public, in front of other parents and teachers. "We should all go together," I announced at breakfast, the first real conversation I'd initiated with Graham in days. "As a family." Graham looked up from his coffee, his expression unreadable. "Of course. What time?" His easy agreement should have relieved me, but something in his tone felt off. Too accommodating, like he was agreeing to something he'd already planned for. The festival was held in the school gymnasium, decorated with colourful student artwork and buzzing with the energy of excited children and proud parents. Etta had a painting displayed near the entrance, a family portrait that showed her between two smiling adults who looked nothing like the tense couple we'd become. "There's my masterpiece," Etta called out, running ahead to show us her work. As we approached the display, I noticed other parents glancing our way with expressions I couldn't quite read. Some smiled and waved, but others seemed to look away quickly, whispering to their spouses. "Beautiful work, Etta," Graham said, his voice warm with genuine pride. It was the most emotion I'd heard from him in weeks. "Mr. and Mrs. Morell." Mrs. Henderson, Etta's teacher, approached with a bright smile that seemed slightly strained. "So wonderful to see you both here." "We wouldn't miss it," I said, trying to project the image of a happy family. "Etta's been so excited about tonight." "Yes, well," Mrs. Henderson's smile flickered slightly. "She's such a talented little artist, very expressive about her family life." Something in her tone made me glance at Graham, but his expression remained neutral. As we moved through the displays, I started to notice a pattern. Other parents were friendly enough, but conversations felt stilted, like people were being careful about what they said. When I complimented Sarah Mitchell's son's sculpture, she smiled politely, but quickly excused herself to check on the refreshment table. "Is it just me, or are people acting weird?" I asked Graham quietly. "Are they?" he replied. but there was something in his tone that suggested he knew exactly why. That's when I spotted Shane across the room with his ex-wife Jennifer and their twin boys. My heart did a little skip, both from excitement and nervousness. Graham and Shane had known each other in college, though they'd never been particularly close. But seeing Shane here, in my family space, felt like worlds colliding in a way that made my pulse quicken. "Oh, look, it's Shane Marwick," I said, perhaps too brightly. "You remember Shane from college, don't you, Graham?" Graham followed my gaze and nodded once. "I remember." We made our way over, Etta skipping ahead to admire the twins' joint project, an elaborate volcano that was drawing crowds of impressed parents. "Graham, Odessa," Shane called out with that easy charm that always made me feel more interesting than I actually was. "Great to see you guys. Jennifer, you remember Graham Morrell from the old days?" Jennifer smiled politely, but I caught her giving me a look that seemed almost pitying. It was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Shane's been such a godsend at work," I said, filling the slightly awkward silence. "Always jumping in to help with the difficult cases. He's got this amazing ability to take charge of any situation." "That's Shane," Jennifer said dryly, "always ready to help." There was definitely something in her tone, but Shane just laughed it off. "What can I say? I like to be useful," he said, and when he looked at me, there was something in his eyes that made me feel warm and reckless. "Some people are just natural leaders," I continued, emboldened by his attention. "They have this presence that commands respect. Not everyone has that quality." I glanced at Graham, expecting to see some reaction, some sign that my words were having the desired effect. Instead, he was watching me with that same calm, analytical expression he used when reviewing architectural plans. "Leadership comes in many forms," he said quietly. "Some people prefer the louder approach." "Well, sometimes you need someone who's not afraid to make noise," I said, my voice gaining confidence. "Someone who fills a room when he walks in. Not everyone can be the strong, silent type." The conversation was starting to draw attention from nearby parents. I could see people slowing down as they passed, pretending to examine student artwork while clearly listening to our exchange. "Mommy," Etta tugged at my sleeve, "can we go see the music room?" "In a minute, sweetheart," I said, not wanting to lose momentum. I was just telling everyone about how different people have different strengths. Take Shane here. He's got this confidence, this bigness about him that just naturally draws people in. Jennifer's eyebrows rose slightly. "Bigness?" "You know what I mean," I said with a laugh that sounded too loud in the suddenly quiet space around us. "Some men just have that larger-than-life quality. They take up space in the best way. They make their presence known." I was vaguely aware that more parents had stopped to listen, that the circle around us was growing, but I felt high on the attention, on finally being able to express what I'd been feeling for weeks. "Not like my Graham here," I continued, reaching over to pat his arm in what I thought was an affectionate gesture. "He's more the quiet type, the smaller approach to life. Which is fine. There's nothing wrong with being compact and contained. Some women prefer that." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel dozens of eyes on us, could see the shock and discomfort on faces around us. Mrs. Henderson looked mortified. Jennifer was staring at me with open disgust. Shane had taken a step back, as if trying to distance himself from what was happening, but it was Etta's voice that cut through the silence like a knife. "Why are you being mean to Daddy?" I looked down at my daughter, seeing confusion and hurt in her 7-year-old eyes, and suddenly the gymnasium felt too hot, too crowded, too full of judging faces. "I wasn't being mean, sweetheart," I said, but my voice sounded shaky even to me. "Mommy was just talking." "It sounded mean," Etta said, and then she did something that broke my heart. She moved closer to Graham, taking his hand protectively. Graham looked down at our daughter with infinite gentleness, then back at me with those same cold, analytical eyes. "I think it's time to go," he said quietly. Etta, would you like to get some ice cream on the way home? Yes, please, she said, still holding his hand, still looking at me like I was a stranger. As they walked away, I stood frozen in the middle of the gymnasium, surrounded by whispering parents and uncomfortable silence. Shane had disappeared entirely, and Jennifer was shaking her head as she gathered her boys and left. Mrs. Henderson approached me with the kind of careful smile adults use when dealing with someone who's having a breakdown. Perhaps you should go home and rest, she suggested gently. It's been a long evening. I wanted to explain, to justify what had happened, to make everyone understand that I wasn't the villain here. But looking around at the faces of people I'd known for years, people who were now looking at me like I was something distasteful they'd stepped in, I realized that explanations might not help. By the time I made it to the parking lot, Graham's car was already gone. I sat in my own car for a long time, replaying the evening and trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. My phone buzzed with a text from Shane. Maybe we should keep things professional for a while. This is getting complicated. I stared at that message, feeling the last bit of support I thought I had crumbling away. Even Shane was abandoning me now, when things got difficult. When I finally made it home, the house was dark except for a light in Graham's study. Through the window, I could see him at his desk, typing something on his laptop, with the same focused intensity he brought to his architectural projects. Something about the scene made me uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on why. It looked less like someone working late and more like someone planning something. The aftermath of the school incident was swift and brutal. By Monday morning, my phone had gone conspicuously quiet. No texts from other parents about playdates, no casual invitations to coffee, no friendly chatter about weekend plans. The silence felt deafening. At work, things weren't much better. Shane had made good on his promise to keep things professional, barely acknowledging me beyond polite nods in the hallway. When I tried to approach him at lunch, he claimed to have plans and hurried away with an uncomfortable expression. "Everything okay with you and Shane?" my colleague Lisa asked during our afternoon break. "You two used to be joined at the hip." "We're just busy with different cases," I lied, but Lisa's knowing look suggested she wasn't buying it. At home, Graham's polite distance had evolved into something even more unsettling: complete indifference. He spoke to me only when absolutely necessary, and even then in the same tone he might use with a service provider. When I tried to bring up what had happened at the school, he simply said, "I think you've said enough," and walked away. The real blow came when I discovered he'd changed all his passwords. His laptop, his phone, even the tablet we'd shared for years. Everything was suddenly locked away from me. When I confronted him about it, his response was maddeningly calm. "I decided I needed more privacy," he said, not looking up from the financial documents he was organizing at the kitchen table. "Privacy from your wife?" I demanded. "What are you hiding?" "Nothing," he replied. "I just think we both need some boundaries right now." The way he said boundaries made my skin crawl. It sounded so final, so deliberately chosen. Like he'd been talking to someone about our situation, maybe a lawyer. That thought sent a chill through me. I started paying closer attention to Graham's routines, looking for signs of what he might be planning. He was working late more often, but when I called his office, his assistant would say he'd already left. His calendar, which used to be shared with me, was now private. Bank statements that used to be left casually on his desk were nowhere to be found. One evening, while Graham was helping Etta with her homework, I decided to search his study. The main computer was password protected, but I managed to find a few printed emails in his desk drawer. Most were work-related, but one caught my attention. A confirmation for a consultation with Morrison and Associates, a law firm downtown. My hand shook as I photographed the email with my phone. A consultation. About what? Divorce? Custody? Both? Looking for something. I spun around to find Graham standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. I was just Looking for a pen, I stammered, shoving the drawer closed. There are pens in the kitchen, he said, stepping into the room. Along with the living room, your purse, and about 6 other places that aren't my private desk. Since when do you have a private desk? I shot back, anger flaring to cover my embarrassment. We're married, Graham. We're supposed to share things. Are we? He asked, and something in his tone made me take a step back. Because lately, it seems like you're sharing quite a lot with other people while keeping your husband in the dark. What's that supposed to mean? It means I know about your lunch dates with Shane, he said calmly. It means I know about the text messages, the late nights at the office, the way you light up whenever his name comes up in conversation. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to maintain eye contact. Shane is a colleague, a friend. I'm allowed to have friends. Of course you are, Graham agreed. Just like I'm allowed to have private conversations with lawyers. The admission hit me like a physical blow. So it was true. He was planning something. You can't be serious, I said, trying to inject authority into my voice. You're going to destroy our family over some harmless flirtation. Harmless? For the first time in weeks, Graham's calm facade cracked slightly. You humiliated me in public, Odessa. Twice. You compared me unfavorably to another man in front of our daughter, my mother, and half the parents at Etta's school. You call that harmless? I was just being honest about our problems. No, he said, his voice dropping back to that terrifying calm. You were being cruel, and if you think this is about harmless flirtation, you're even more deluded than I thought. He moved to his desk and pulled out a manila folder I hadn't noticed before. From it, he extracted several printed pages, screenshots of text messages, email chains, even what looked like security footage from our office building. Your lunch dates with Shane, he said, laying out the evidence like a prosecutor presenting a case. The parking garage conversations, the messages about how understanding he is, how big and dynamic compared to your small husband. I stared at the papers in horror. How had he gotten all of this? How long had he been collecting evidence? You've been spying on me, I whispered. I've been protecting myself, he corrected, and protecting Etta. Because unlike you, I actually think about how my actions might affect our daughter. Our daughter? You're the one planning to tear apart her family. I'm not tearing apart anything, Graham said, gathering the papers back into the folder. I'm simply preparing for the inevitable. You've made it very clear that you're not happy in this marriage, that you find me inadequate, that you're seeking satisfaction elsewhere. I'm just making sure that when this ends, it ends fairly. The word when hit me like ice water, not if. When. Graham, please, I said, hearing the desperation in my own voice. Can't we talk about this? Can't we try counseling or... Talk? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Like we talked at dinner, like we talked at Etta's school. I think we've done enough talking, don't you? He moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Odessa. I'd be careful about those text messages with Shane. His wife might be interested to know about his professional relationships with married colleagues. The threat was delivered in the same calm tone he used for everything else, but it sent a spike of panic through me. Jennifer already suspected something. I'd seen it in her face at the school. If Graham had evidence... You wouldn't, I said. I don't want to, he replied, but if you push this, if you try to make things difficult in the divorce, I'll use every piece of evidence I have to protect my daughter's best interests. And believe me, I have quite a collection now. After he left, I sank into his desk chair, surrounded by his architectural awards and family photos that now felt like artifacts from a different life. On his desk, I noticed a legal pad with notes written in his precise handwriting. I could only make out a few phrases. Custody arrangement, financial disclosure, character witnesses. My phone buzzed with a text from Jules. Haven't heard from you in a while. Everything okay? I stared at the message, trying to figure out how to explain that my marriage was ending, that my husband had been building a case against me for weeks, that I'd somehow become the villain in my own life story. Instead, I typed back, "Everything's fine, just busy." But as I sat in Graham's study, surrounded by evidence of his methodical planning, I realized that everything was very far from fine. And for the first time since this all began, I started to wonder if I'd made a terrible mistake. Outside, I could hear Graham reading Etta her bedtime story, his voice warm and patient, in a way it hadn't been with me in months. The sound made my chest ache with something that might have been regret if I'd been willing to admit it. The next few weeks passed in a strange, suspended tension. Graham continued his methodical routine, work, time with Etta, long evenings locked in his study. I tried to maintain some sense of normalcy, but it felt like play acting in a theatre where I was the only one who didn't know the script. Shane had completely cut off contact now, avoiding me so obviously at work that even our supervisor noticed. When I finally cornered him in the break room, his response was devastating in its simplicity. "Look, Odessa, I like you, but I'm not looking to get dragged into a messy divorce. Jennifer's already asking questions, and honestly, your husband seems like the type who documents everything. I can't afford that kind of drama." So much for his promises about appreciating what he had. At home, I found myself studying Graham with new eyes, looking for cracks in his composed facade. But if anything, he seemed more focused than ever. He'd started going to the gym regularly, had gotten a haircut, even bought some new clothes. If I didn't know better, I'd think he was preparing for something. Or someone. The realization hit me with sudden, jealous clarity. Graham was getting ready to be single again. "Are you seeing someone?" I confronted him one evening, after Etta had gone to bed. He looked up from his laptop with that same maddeningly calm expression. "Why would you ask that?" "You're different. You're preparing for something." "I'm preparing for a lot of things," he said, "but no, I'm not seeing anyone. Unlike some people, I take my marriage vows seriously, right up until the moment they're legally dissolved." The formal way he spoke about our marriage, like it was a business contract being terminated, sent a chill through me. "Graham, please, can't we try to work this out, for Etta's sake?" "For Etta's sake," he repeated slowly. "Interesting that you're concerned about her now. Were you thinking about Etta when you humiliated me in front of her classmates' parents? Were you considering her feelings during those long lunches with Shane?" "That's not fair. I never meant for any of this to affect her." "But it did affect her," he said, closing the laptop with decisive finality. "She's been asking me why Mommy doesn't like Daddy anymore. She wants to know if it's her fault that we don't eat dinner together as a family. She's 7 years old, Odessa, and she's trying to figure out why her mother treats her father with such obvious contempt." The words hit me like physical blows. I thought I'd been protecting Etta from our problems, but apparently, I'd been fooling myself about that too. "I don't treat you with contempt," I said weakly. Graham stood up, gathering his papers with the same precise movements he brought to everything else. "You called me small and inadequate in front of our daughter," he said quietly. "You praised another man's attributes while discussing your husband's limitations. You did this not once, but twice, in public settings where our family's private business became entertainment for others. If that's not contempt, what would you call it?" I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to explain that I'd just been frustrated and looking for attention. But looking at Graham's face, calm, resolved, and completely done with me, I realized that explanations were no longer relevant. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you get served," he said simply. "Probably tomorrow, based on my attorney's timeline." The casual way he delivered this information made it somehow worse, like he was telling me about a dentist appointment or a work meeting. "You've already filed?" "Last week. I wanted to give you time to adjust to the idea, but I think we're past the point of gradual transitions." I felt something crumble inside my chest. "Graham, I'll be staying at my mother's for a few days. he continued as if I hadn't spoken. With Etta, I think it's better if we start establishing some boundaries while the legal process moves forward. You can't take my daughter away from me. I'm not taking her away. I'm protecting her from more public scenes and adult conversations she shouldn't have to witness. You'll have plenty of time with her once we establish a formal custody arrangement. The word custody made everything suddenly, brutally real. This wasn't just about our marriage ending. This was about dividing up our daughter like a piece of property. She belongs here, I said desperately. This is her home. This was her home, Graham corrected gently. But homes are supposed to be safe spaces where people treat each other with respect. Etta needs to see what that looks like again. He moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Odessa, I didn't want this. 6 months ago, if you'd come to me and said you were unhappy, if you'd asked for counseling or suggested we work on our problems together, I would have done anything to fix this marriage. But you didn't do that. Instead, you chose to humiliate me publicly while pursuing another man privately. You made this choice for both of us. After he left, I sat alone in our living room, surrounded by the carefully chosen furniture and family photos that now felt like evidence of a life that was already over. My phone sat silent on the coffee table. No supportive texts from friends, no romantic messages from Shane, no one reaching out to check on me. For the first time in months, I was completely, utterly alone with the consequences of my choices. The next morning, I woke up to an empty house and a manila envelope slipped under the front door. Inside were legal documents with official seals and formal language that reduced our 8-year marriage to a series of financial calculations and custody arrangements. At the bottom of the stack was a handwritten note in Graham's precise script. I've documented everything, Odessa. The messages, the public incidents, the timeline of your relationship with Shane. If you contest this or try to make things difficult, I'll use all of it. For Etta's sake, I hope you'll choose to handle this with dignity. I read the note 3 times before the full weight of it hit me. Graham hadn't just been preparing for divorce, he'd been preparing for war. And he'd been doing it with the same methodical precision he brought to his architectural projects. My phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. It was Jules. Des, I just heard from Mum that Graham and Etta are staying with his mother. What's going on? I tried to explain, but the words came out in a jumbled mess of justifications and accusations. Jules listened in increasingly uncomfortable silence. Oh, Des, she said finally. What did you do? It was the same question I'd been asking myself, but hearing it from my sister made it impossible to avoid anymore. What had I done? And more importantly, was there any way to undo it? Looking at the divorce papers scattered across my coffee table, I was starting to suspect the answer was no. The legal process unfolded with Graham's signature precision. Within weeks, I faced supervised visitation with Etta twice weekly. His attorney had painted me unstable, dangerous even. Evidence mounted relentlessly. Timestamped texts with Shane, parking garage footage of intimate talks, restaurant witness statements, affidavits from humiliated parents. Worst was the secret recording of my cruel joke at family dinner. My voice calling Graham too tiny to be a father, played in a cold conference room, turning my stomach. My lawyer, Patricia, was blunt. They've got you on emotional abuse and infidelity. The public humiliation, especially with Etta present, is damning. Take their deal. The deal granted Graham primary custody, the house, stability for our daughter. I received my car, half our savings, alimony I could barely live on, and alternate weekends supervised for 6 months. Socially, I became toxic. The video went viral, labeled me abusive. Friends vanished, colleagues distanced themselves. Shane transferred branches. His wife divorced him for the same emotional infidelity I'd enabled. He'd been a pattern, not an exception. In court, Graham sat composed, quietly confident, bigger, somehow, than I'd ever allowed him to be. My apologies rang hollow. The judge awarded him custody based on documented patterns of cruelty and poor judgment. His note afterward: "I hope you find what you were looking for. For Etta's sake, do it quickly and quietly." 6 months later, visits became unsupervised, but Etta remained distant, more at ease with Graham and his fiancée Sarah. 5 years on, I live alone, working quietly, watching Etta thrive in their respectful home while I carry the weight of choices I can't undo. Graham had been right. Steady strength isn't small. I mistook it for weakness until the truth, documented, undeniable, took everything away. Actions have consequences. Some lessons arrived too late to rebuild what was lost,